On a cotton plantation called Bellevue in the Mississippi Delta in 1846, there existed a locked door on the second floor of the main plantation house that no enslaved worker was ever allowed to approach, that white overseers were forbidden from entering without explicit permission from the owner, and that was kept secured with 3 separate locks whose keys were held personally by the plantation's master, a man named Edmund Ashworth, who had built his fortune through cotton cultivation and who maintained absolute control over every aspect of life on his 4,000-acre property, worked by 267 enslaved people. The door led to what Ashworth called his private study, a room that occupied the entire east wing of the house's second floor, and that was separated from the rest of the living quarters by thick walls, and by a corridor that servants were instructed to avoid whenever possible. For 23 years, from 1823, when Ashworth first established Bellevue, until his death in 1846, that door remained locked to everyone except Ashworth himself, and the enslaved people who worked in the plantation house whispered constantly about what might be hidden behind it, developing elaborate theories that ranged from treasure rooms to evidence of crimes to supernatural explanations that reflected the deep fear and unease that the locked door inspired in people who lived under Ashworth's absolute power. The truth about what the room contained would not be discovered until Ashworth's death in April 1846, when his heirs finally forced open the door and found contents so disturbing that they immediately sealed the room again, destroyed most of what was inside, and maintained silence about their discoveries for decades. But enough evidence survived, and enough witnesses eventually spoke, that historians would eventually piece together the horrifying truth about Edmund Ashworth's locked room, and about the crimes he had committed there for over 2 decades. Before we descend into the nightmare of what Ashworth kept hidden and what it revealed about slavery's absolute power and absolute corruption, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we unlock the doors that concealed history's darkest secrets. Edmund Ashworth was born in 1785 in coastal South Carolina to a family of modest planter class, and he had moved to Mississippi in 1820 as part of the wave of white settlement that followed the forced removal of Native American populations from the region, and that transformed the Mississippi Delta into the center of American cotton production. Ashworth arrived in Mississippi with some capital inherited from his father, with experience in cotton cultivation from his South Carolina background, and with ambitions to establish himself among the Delta's planter elite. He purchased land near what would become the town of Greenville, established Bellevue Plantation, and began the process of clearing land and establishing cotton operations that would make him wealthy. By 1825, just 5 years after arriving in Mississippi, Ashworth owned approximately 2,000 acres, worked by 98 enslaved people, and he had established himself as a successful planter whose operations were profitable and whose social position was secure. By 1840, Bellevue had expanded to over 4,000 acres, worked by 267 enslaved people, making it one of the larger operations in the region, and making Ashworth one of the wealthiest men in the Mississippi Delta. His success was built on the typical plantation model of extracting maximum labor from enslaved workers while investing minimal resources in their welfare, a model that generated enormous profits for owners like Ashworth, while creating conditions of systematic brutality for the people who actually produced the wealth through their forced labor. The construction of the locked room occurred in 1823, the same year that Ashworth completed building the main plantation house at Bellevue. The house was a substantial Greek revival structure, 3 stories tall with massive columns and elaborate decorative elements designed to display Ashworth's wealth and to establish his status among the Delta elite. The second floor contained the family's private quarters, including bedrooms for Ashworth, his wife Caroline, and their 3 children, plus guest rooms and sitting rooms that were typical of wealthy plantation houses. But the east wing of the second floor, which should have been divided into additional bedrooms or living spaces, was instead constructed as a single large room accessed by a single door that Ashworth had fitted with 3 separate locks of different types, apparently to ensure that the room could not be opened without his explicit authorization, even if someone obtained 1 or 2 of the keys. The construction workers who built the house, most of whom were enslaved carpenters and craftsmen, later reported, in testimonies recorded decades after the fact, that Ashworth had personally supervised the construction of this room and had insisted on specific features, including walls that were thicker than necessary for normal construction, windows that were fitted with heavy shutters that could be closed and locked from inside, ventilation systems that were more elaborate than typical rooms required, and most ominously, floor drains that connected to pipes leading to a cistern beneath the house, features that suggested the room was designed for activities that would produce waste or fluids that needed to be disposed of discreetly. The rules surrounding the locked door were established immediately upon the house's completion and were enforced with threats of severe punishment that made clear Ashworth considered any violation to be a serious offense warranting brutal response. Enslaved people who worked in the house, cleaning, cooking, and serving the Ashworth family were explicitly instructed never to approach the locked door, never to attempt to look through the keyhole or under the door, and never to discuss what might be in the room or to speculate about why it was kept locked. White overseers who supervised plantation operations and who had relatively privileged positions, compared to enslaved workers, were similarly instructed that the room was off-limits and that attempting to enter it without Ashworth's explicit permission would result in immediate dismissal and potentially in legal action for trespassing or theft. Even Ashworth's wife Carolyn and his children were apparently not allowed into the room, or at least were strongly discouraged from entering, with Ashworth maintaining that the room contained business records and personal papers that required privacy and security. The enforcement of these rules was absolute. On at least 3 documented occasions, enslaved workers who had been caught near the locked door or who had been suspected of trying to peek inside were subjected to severe whippings and other punishments that served as public demonstrations of what would happen to anyone who violated Ashworth's commands about the room. The speculation about what the locked room contained became a constant topic of whispered conversation among the enslaved people at Bellevue, conversation that mixed genuine attempts to understand what, Ashworth might be hiding with elements of folklore and supernatural belief that reflected the powerlessness and fear that characterized life under slavery. Some believed the room contained Ashworth's accumulated wealth in gold and silver, treasure that he was hiding from potential thieves, or from creditors, or from family members who might try to claim inheritance. Others thought the room held evidence of crimes Ashworth had committed, perhaps murder victims or stolen property or documents proving illegal activities. A few believed the room was used for occult practices, that Ashworth consulted with dark powers to maintain his wealth and control, and that the room was where these supernatural consultations occurred. And some suspected, with what would turn out to be prescient accuracy, that the room was where Ashworth conducted activities that were too shameful or too criminal to be done in spaces where others might observe. Activities that required absolute privacy and absolute control over who could witness what happened there. These speculations were not idle curiosity, but were attempts by enslaved people to understand a man who had absolute power over their lives and to identify any knowledge that might provide leverage or protection or at least insight into what motivated someone capable of the casual cruelty that all slaveholders exercised, but that Ashworth seemed to embrace with particular enthusiasm. The pattern of Ashworth's visits to the locked room, as observed by enslaved house servants who worked in other parts of the second floor, and who could not help but notice when their owner spent time in the mysterious space, provided clues about what activities might be occurring there, even though the actual contents remained hidden. Ashworth typically entered the room in the evenings after dinner, spending anywhere from 1 to 3 hours inside before emerging and returning to his bedroom or to the ground floor library where he conducted plantation business. These evening visits occurred several times per week and appeared to be a regular routine rather than occasional special events. But more disturbing were the occasions, occurring perhaps once or twice per month, when Ashworth would summon specific enslaved people to accompany him to the second floor and would take them into the locked room, closing and securing the door behind them. Most of these individuals would emerge from the room after an hour or two, looking shaken and traumatized, but refusing to speak about what had occurred inside. But on several documented occasions, individuals who entered the locked room with Ashworth were never seen again by the other enslaved people at Bellevue, and Ashworth would later claim they had been sold to traders or had run away or had died from disease, explanations that the enslaved community found suspicious given the timing immediately following disappearances into the locked room. The terror that the locked room inspired in Bellevue's enslaved population was intensified by one particular incident in 1837, when a house servant named Rebecca was ordered to accompany Ashworth to the second floor and was taken into the locked room. Rebecca had been at Bellevue for over 10 years and was known as a skilled and reliable worker who had managed to avoid the worst punishments by being careful and submissive. But whatever happened to Rebecca in the locked room that day transformed her in ways that made clear she had experienced something horrific. When she emerged several hours later, witnesses reported that she was barely conscious, that she appeared to have been beaten severely, and that she was covered in blood, both her own and what appeared to be blood from another source. Rebecca was taken to the slave hospital, crude infirmary where sick and injured enslaved people were kept, where she remained for several weeks, before dying from her injuries and from infection. Before her death, Rebecca spoke to other enslaved women about what she had seen in the locked room, descriptions that were so disturbing that the women who heard them refused to repeat the details even decades later when they were interviewed by historians. What is known is that Rebecca described seeing things in the room that suggested Ashworth was conducting some form of medical experiments or dissections on enslaved people, that there were restraints and surgical instruments, and that there were preserved specimens of some kind that Rebecca interpreted as evidence of previous victims. Rebecca's death was officially attributed to fever in plantation records, but the enslaved community understood that she had been killed by whatever Ashworth had done to her in the locked room. The question of whether anyone outside the enslaved community at Bellevue knew about or suspected what Ashworth might be doing in his locked room is important for understanding how such activities could continue for over 2 decades without intervention. Ashworth's wife, Carolyn, certainly knew that he spent time in the locked room and that he sometimes took enslaved people there, but whether she knew or suspected the nature of his activities is unclear. Caroline Ashworth apparently maintained the willful ignorance that many slave-holding women practiced about their husbands' treatment of enslaved people, focusing on managing the household and on social activities while avoiding knowledge about the specific cruelties that made their comfortable lives possible. Ashworth's overseers and other white employees knew about the locked room and about the rules surrounding it, but they were either genuinely unaware of what happened inside or chose not to investigate, because doing so would have jeopardized their positions, and because the culture of slavery encouraged whites to respect other whites' absolute authority over their enslaved property, even when that authority was exercised in disturbing ways. And while some planters who visited Bellevue might have heard rumors about Ashworth's locked room and about unexplained disappearances among his enslaved population, such rumors were not unusual for any plantation and would not have triggered serious investigation in a society where enslaved people's suffering was considered their owner's private business. Edmund Ashworth's death on April 15, 1846, came suddenly when he suffered what was probably a heart attack or stroke while working in his ground floor office, and his death created an immediate practical problem regarding the locked room, because no one except Ashworth knew where all 3 keys were located, and because his heirs needed to inventory his estate, including whatever was behind the sealed door. Ashworth's oldest son, William, who was 28 years old in 1846, and who had been managing some aspects of Bellevue's operations under his father's supervision, organized the search for the keys and eventually located them in various hiding places that Ashworth had used, including 1 key in his bedroom safe, 1 key sewn into the lining of a coat in his wardrobe, and 1 key hidden in a hollowed-out book in his library. The difficulty in locating all 3 keys and the elaborate hiding places suggested that Ashworth had been very concerned about preventing unauthorized access to the room even after his death, and this concern intensified the family's curiosity about what might be inside. When William and his 2 brothers finally unlocked and opened the door on April 18, 1846, 3 days after their father's death. What they found inside shocked and horrified them, despite their having grown up in a culture that normalized violence against enslaved people, and despite whatever suspicions they might have harbored at their father's activities. The descriptions of what the Ashworth brothers found in the locked room come from multiple sources, including a letter that William Ashworth wrote to a cousin several months after the discovery, testimony given by enslaved people who were ordered to help clean out the room, and accounts recorded by a lawyer who was involved in settling Edmund Ashworth's estate and who saw the room briefly before it was cleaned and sealed. These sources are consistent in their descriptions of a space that had been used for medical experimentation and torture on enslaved people over a period of many years. A space that combined elements of a medical laboratory, a torture chamber, and a museum for preserving evidence of Ashworth's activities. The room contained a large wooden table fitted with leather restraints for holding subjects immobile during procedures. It contained an extensive collection of medical and surgical instruments, including scalpels, saws, needles, clamps, and devices whose purposes were not immediately obvious, but that appeared, designed to cause pain or to conduct invasive procedures. It contained shelves holding jars with preserved specimens that appeared to be human organs and tissue samples, each jar labeled with a date and with notations in Ashworth's handwriting describing what the specimen was and from whom it had been taken. It contained notebooks filled with detailed records of experiments Ashworth had conducted, descriptions of surgical procedures he had attempted, observations about subjects' responses to various treatments, and notes about results, including frequent notations about subjects dying from procedures or from infections that developed afterward. The most disturbing aspect of what the Ashworth brothers found in the locked room, beyond the physical evidence of torture and experimentation, was the sheer scale and systematic nature of what their father had been doing. The notebooks documented over 2 decades of activities, beginning in 1823, when the room was first constructed, and continuing until just weeks before Edmund Ashworth's death. The records suggested that Ashworth had experimented on at least 50 different enslaved people over this period, conducting procedures that ranged from relatively minor to horrifically invasive, and that at least 15 of these individuals had died as direct results of what Ashworth had done to them. The notebooks revealed that Ashworth had been particularly interested in testing surgical techniques, in studying pain tolerance under various conditions, in investigating racial differences in anatomy and physiology, and in attempting procedures that were considered too dangerous or experimental to perform on white patients, but that Ashworth felt free to attempt on enslaved subjects who had no ability to refuse and whose deaths would not be investigated beyond the cursory plantation records, claiming they had died of disease or accident. The clinical detachment with which Ashworth had documented these experiments, describing human suffering in the same impersonal language that might be used for laboratory animals, made clear that he had completely dehumanized his victims and had seen them purely as material for satisfying his medical curiosity. The Ashworth family's response to discovering the contents of the locked room was driven by a combination of genuine horror at the Yashur, what their father had done, and by pragmatic concerns about protecting the family's reputation and wealth. William Ashworth and his brothers were shocked by the evidence of systematic torture and murder that the room contained, and they apparently engaged in serious discussions about whether to report their father's crimes to authorities or to make the information public in some way. But they ultimately decided that revealing what Edmund Ashworth had done would destroy the family's social position, would create legal complications regarding the estate, since Edmund had died before he could be prosecuted, and would potentially expose the family to claims from descendants of the victims or to other legal actions that could threaten their inherited wealth. So the brothers made the decision to cover up the crimes by destroying most of the evidence and by maintaining public silence about what they had discovered. Over a period of several days in late April 1846, enslaved workers were ordered to remove all the equipment, specimens, and notebooks from the locked room, and to burn everything in a bonfire that consumed the physical evidence of Edmund Ashworth's activities. The room itself was thoroughly cleaned, stripped of anything that might suggest its previous use, and then sealed again with the official explanation that it contained family papers too sensitive to be examined by outsiders and would remain closed indefinitely. But the Ashworth family's attempts to suppress knowledge of what had been in the locked room were only partially successful because the enslaved people who had been ordered to help clean and empty the room saw what was being destroyed and passed that information along to the wider enslaved community. And because William Ashworth's letter to his cousin describing the discovery was preserved and eventually came to light when that cousin's papers were donated to a historical archive in the early 20th century. The enslaved workers who had carried the equipment, specimens, and notebooks out of the room, and who had thrown them into the fire, had seen enough to confirm what they had long suspected, that Edmund Ashworth had been conducting horrific experiments, that the locked room had been where many of their friends and family members had been tortured and killed, and that the disappearances that had occurred over the years had not been due to sales or escapes, but had been murders concealed through Ashworth's absolute power over plantation record-keeping. This knowledge spread through the enslaved community, not just at Bellevue, but throughout the region, as people who had connections to Bellevue shared what they had learned. And the story of Edmund Ashworth's locked room became part of the oral tradition that enslaved people maintained about the specific cruelties they experienced, and about the particular individuals who were most dangerous and most evil, even by the degraded moral standards of slave-holding society. The legal and moral questions about whether Edmund Ashworth's heirs had any obligation to report his crimes or to provide compensation, or acknowledgement to the families of his victims, were never seriously addressed during the 19th century because the legal system provided essentially no remedies for crimes committed against enslaved people by their owners, and because the social and political power of families like the Ashworths meant they could suppress uncomfortable truths without facing consequences. Edmund Ashworth had died before he could be prosecuted, and under the legal principles of the time, crimes died with the perpetrator unless there were specific victims or evidence that demanded action. But the victims of Ashworth's experiments were enslaved people whose legal status as property rather than as persons meant their deaths were not considered murders in any legal sense. And the evidence of what Ashworth had done had been deliberately destroyed by his heirs before authorities could examine it. The result was that Edmund Ashworth's crimes were never officially investigated. No charges were ever filed against anyone involved, and the victims were never acknowledged or memorialized by any official process. The only justice, such as it was, came from the historical record that eventually documented what had occurred, and from the oral traditions that preserved the victims' memories even when official history tried to erase them. The recovery of the full story of Edmund Ashworth's locked room required historians in the late 20th and early 21st centuries to piece together evidence from multiple fragmentary sources, because the Ashworth family had successfully suppressed most contemporary documentation of what had been discovered in 1846. The key breakthrough came in 1987 when William Ashworth's 1846 letter describing the locked room's contents was discovered in an archive at Louisiana State University as part of a collection of family papers donated decades earlier. This letter provided the first detailed written account of what the room had contained and confirmed that the oral traditions about Ashworth conducting experiments on enslaved people were based on actual documented evidence rather than being exaggerated rumors. Subsequent research identified other sources, including testimony from formerly enslaved people that had been recorded by interviewers in the 1930s as part of federal writers' Project Slave Narratives, testimony that included references to Edmund Ashworth and to the locked room at Bellevue, though these references had not been understood in context until William Ashworth's letter provided confirmation. Historians also examined plantation records from Bellevue, looking for patterns in recorded deaths and disappearances that might corroborate the story, and they found that mortality rates among Bellevue's enslaved population were significantly higher than regional averages, and that there were multiple instances of individuals listed as having died from diseases or accidents in circumstances where the recorded explanations seemed suspicious or incomplete. The comparison between Edmund Ashworth's activities and other documented cases of medical experimentation on enslaved people in the antebellum South revealed that Ashworth's case, while extreme in its scale and in its systematic nature, was not entirely unique and was part of a broader pattern of how slaveholders and physicians exploited enslaved people as experimental subjects. The most famous example is J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of gynecology, who developed surgical techniques by repeatedly operating on enslaved women without anesthesia, treating their suffering as irrelevant to his medical advancement. But historians have documented many other cases where physicians used enslaved people to test treatments, to study diseases by deliberately infecting subjects, to practice surgical techniques that they were not confident enough to attempt on white patients, and to conduct research motivated by theories about racial differences in anatomy and physiology. What distinguished Ashworth's case was that he appears to have been acting primarily from personal curiosity and sadistic interest rather than from scientific ambition or from desire to advance medical knowledge, and that he conducted his experiments in complete secrecy in his locked room, rather than in the more semi-public context of hospitals or medical schools where other doctors' experiments occurred. This secrecy and this personal motivation suggested that even Ashworth recognized that what he was doing went beyond what the medical community would have accepted as legitimate research, that it was motivated by interests that were more about power and control and sadism than about contributing to medical science. The psychological profile of Edmund Ashworth that emerges from the documented evidence about his activities in the locked room suggests a man who combined genuine intellectual curiosity about medical questions with profound sadism and with complete absence of empathy toward enslaved people, seeing them as objects to be used rather than as human beings whose suffering mattered. Ashworth's notebooks, portions of which were transcribed in William Ashworth's letter before being destroyed, revealed someone who approached his experiments with systematic method and careful documentation, recording procedures and results with attention to detail that suggested genuine interest in what he might learn. But the notebooks also revealed complete indifference to his subject's suffering, describing pain and death in clinical terms, without any indication of moral concern or hesitation about inflicting such suffering. This combination of methodical intelligence and ethical void was characteristic of how slavery corrupted even those slaveholders who might in other contexts have been capable of genuine scientific contribution, allowing them to treat human beings as experimental material, simply because the law classified those human beings as property, and because absolute power removed any external constraints on how that property could be used. The impact of Edmund Ashworth's activities and of the locked room on the enslaved community at Bellevue was profound and extended far beyond the immediate victims to shape how everyone at the plantation understood their situation and their vulnerability. The locked room became a symbol of the absolute power that slaveholders wielded and of the complete absence of protection or recourse that enslaved people had against even the most extreme violations. Knowing that their owner had been conducting experiments and murders in a locked room for over 20 years, that he had gotten away with it completely because the law and society did not recognize their humanity or their right to protection, and that even after his death, his crimes would not be punished or even officially acknowledged, reinforced the terrorizing message that slavery was designed to deliver, that enslaved people were completely powerless, and that challenging or resisting their owners was futile because there was no authority to which they could appeal and no protection they could expect. This message was not unique to Bellevue. Every plantation delivered similar messages through violence and through demonstrations of owners. Absolute power, but the locked room made the message especially vivid and especially terrifying because it represented premeditated, systematic cruelty rather than the impulsive violence that characterized most plantation discipline. The fate of Bellevue Plantation after Edmund Ashworth's death in 1846 followed the typical pattern of inheritance, where the property and the enslaved people who worked it were divided among heirs or were managed by the oldest son on behalf of the family. William Ashworth took over management of Bellevue and continued operating it as a cotton plantation using slave labor until the Civil War ended slavery in 1865. Whether William and his brothers, having discovered what their father had done in the locked room, treated the enslaved people at Bellevue any differently than Edmund had treated them is unclear from available records, though there is no evidence that they abandoned the plantation or freed any enslaved people out of horror at what they had discovered. The pragmatic need to maintain the family's wealth and the social normalization of violence against enslaved people apparently outweighed whatever moral revulsion they felt about their father's specific crimes. The locked room itself remained sealed after being cleaned in 1846, and it stayed sealed throughout the remaining years of slavery and beyond. When Union forces occupied the region during the Civil War, they did not investigate the room or discover its history. When Bellevue was eventually sold in the 1870s to pay debts that the family accumulated during Reconstruction, the new owners apparently were never told about the room's history. And when the house burned down in 1923, destroying the physical evidence of the room's existence, its history was known only through oral traditions that were not yet taken seriously by professional historians. The preservation of the story of Edmund Ashworth's locked room through oral tradition in Black communities in Mississippi and through fragmentary written sources that survived demonstrates the importance of taking seriously testimony and stories that might not have been created through official channels or that might not fit comfortable narratives about the past. For over 140 years after Edmund Ashworth's death, the story of the locked room was dismissed by most historians who encountered references to it as being either exaggerated legend or complete fabrication, because it seemed too extreme and because there was no hard documentary evidence from official sources to corroborate it. The story survived primarily through families descended from people who had been enslaved at Bellevue, families who passed down knowledge about Edmund Ashworth and about the locked room and about the people who had been his victims. When historians finally took these oral traditions seriously in the 1980s and began actively searching for documentary evidence, they found William Ashworth's letter and other corroborating sources that confirmed the essential truth of what the oral tradition had preserved. This vindication of oral history against official silence was significant not just for this specific case, but for demonstrating that the absence of documentation in official archives did not mean that events had not occurred, and that people whose voices were excluded from official record keeping found other ways to preserve historical memory and to ensure that crimes committed against them would eventually be acknowledged, even if justice was never achieved. The question of how many other locked rooms existed on plantations throughout the South, places where slaveholders conducted activities so extreme or so shameful that they needed to be hidden even from other whites, is impossible to answer definitively, but is important for understanding the full scope of slavery's horrors. The evidence suggests that Edmund Ashworth was not the only slaveholder who experimented on enslaved people, or who conducted activities that went beyond the everyday cruelties of slavery into realm of systematic torture and murder. Medical historians have documented extensive exploitation of enslaved people for experimental purposes. Archaeological investigations of Plantation sites have occasionally found evidence of violence and disposal of bodies that suggests possible systematic abuse beyond what plantation records acknowledged, and oral traditions from formerly enslaved people and Th. Iyer descendants contain numerous stories about forbidden places. On plantations where masters conducted activities that workers were not allowed to witness, and where some workers disappeared, never to be seen again. While not all these stories refer to situations as extreme as Ashworth's locked room, they collectively suggest that hidden systematic cruelty was more common than official records indicated, and that many slaveholders took advantage of their absolute power to indulge interests and behaviors that even slave society would have found troubling if fully exposed. The modern significance of Edmund Ashworth's story and of the locked room at Bellevue extends to ongoing debates about historical memory, about how to memorialize victims of atrocities that were deliberately hidden, and about what responsibilities contemporary society has toward addressing historical crimes, whose perpetrators are long dead, but whose effects persist. The site where Bellevue Plantation once stood is now farmland, with no physical evidence remaining of the plantation house or of the locked room where Ashworth conducted his experiments. There is no historical marker acknowledging what occurred there, no memorial to the victims whose names were never even recorded in most cases, and no formal recognition from state or local authorities that documented crimes occurred on that site. This absence of memorialization is typical of how sites associated with slavery's specific cruelties are often ignored or forgotten, partly because acknowledging them is uncomfortable, and partly because determining what form appropriate memorialization should take is difficult when victims were not individually identified, and when the crimes were so extensive and so systematic. But advocates for historical justice argue that places like Bellevue deserve acknowledgement, and that the victims of crimes like Edmund Ashworth's deserve to be remembered even if they cannot be named individually, and that contemporary society has an obligation to engage with the full truth about slavery's violence, rather than limiting acknowledgement to general statements about slavery being wrong, while avoiding the specific horrifying details that make that wrongness real and undeniable. What should we remember about Edmund Ashworth's locked room, and about the crimes he committed there for over 20 years? That a locked door on the second floor of a Mississippi plantation house concealed one of slavery's most horrifying secrets, a space where systematic medical experimentation and torture occurred from 1823 until 1846, that Edmund Ashworth used his absolute power as a slaveholder to conduct experiments on at least 50 enslaved people, killing at least 15 of them, and subjecting all to horrific treatment that he documented in clinical detail in notebooks that treated their suffering as data. That enslaved people at Bellevue knew something terrible was happening in the locked room, but were powerless to stop it or to bring attention to it, because the legal system did not recognize their testimony or protect them from their owner's actions. That when Ashworth's sons discovered the room's contents after his death in 1846, they chose to destroy the evidence and cover up the crimes rather than seeking justice for the victims or acknowledging what their father had done. That the story survived through oral tradition, maintained by descendants of enslaved people at Bellevue, despite official attempts to suppress it. That historians eventually confirmed the truth of the story through documentary evidence that corroborated what oral tradition had preserved. That Ashworth's case, while extreme, was part of a broader, pattern of medical experimentation on enslaved people that characterized antebellum medicine and that revealed how slavery corrupted science by providing research subjects who could be exploited without consent or concern for their welfare, and that no one was ever held accountable for Ashworth's crimes. No memorial exists for his victims, and the site where these horrors occurred is unmarked and forgotten by official history, even though the truth has finally been documented and acknowledged by scholars. What do you think about Edmund Ashworth's locked room, and about the fact that such crimes could continue for over 20 years without intervention? How should we judge his son's decision to destroy evidence and cover up the crimes rather than seeking justice for victims? What responsibility does contemporary society have to memorialize victims of crimes like these, even when victims' names are unknown and when perpetrators died long ago? And what does Ashworth's case tell us about slavery's systematic corruption of medicine, and about how absolute power-enabled horrors that most people would prefer to believe never happened? Leave your thoughts below. If the story of the locked room that no worker was allowed to open challenged your understanding of slavery's specific cruelties and demonstrated how deliberate suppression kept such horrors hidden for generations, hit subscribe for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We unlock the doors that concealed history's darkest secrets, and we ensure that victims who were deliberately erased from official memory are finally acknowledged and remembered. Share this with someone who needs to understand that slavery's evil was even more systematic and more deliberately hidden than most people recognize. The locked door stayed closed for 23 years. Now the truth is open. Remember it.